Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles, and I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to get in touch with us with comments or questions, or to request a Bible study, or to request our weekly bulletin, you can get in touch with us at 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org. We'd be happy to get back to you with either of those. You can also join us in person at our building for our Sunday morning worship at 10 a.m. and our Sunday afternoon worship at 4. Yeah, that is at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh, and we're also there at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for a Bible study. We do a radio show on Sunday afternoons at 2. That is on 98.5 FM and 1400 AM, and we'd be happy to have you join us for that as well. And, of course, you can find our live-streamed worship services on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/River Ridge Church of Christ. And you can also find past TV programs on there for further study. Our Facebook page is another way that you can get in touch with us, and of course our website is riverridgechurch.org. We are in John's Gospel again today, and we're going to be tackling chapter 15 this time. If you're not caught up, then I would recommend you go to our YouTube channel and subscribe to that. And you can also find the playlist that is called John's Gospel Series and start all the way back in chapter 1 where we began, I think it was in March, and catch up to where we are now as we get into the last couple of episodes of John's Gospel. Let's recap a little bit from last time before we get into chapter 15. This is still part of the same long, drawn-out discussion where Jesus does most of the talking. They have shared the Passover meal. Jesus has washed the feet of his disciples. He predicted their upcoming failure, although he focused it a lot more on Peter than everybody else. He also promised them comfort, and he promised that he was going to prepare a place for them in heaven and send the Holy Spirit to help them, and a whole lot of that sort of thing. And then we finished up in chapter 14 with verses 29 through 31, where he says, "And now I have told you before it takes place, so that when it does take place you may believe. I will no longer talk much with you, for the ruler of this world is coming. He has no claim on me, but I do as the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father. Rise, let us go from here." So he's talking a lot there about some of the same things that we were just mentioning, as well as predictions of what is going to happen the rest of this long evening. And then we get this little clue at the end of verse 31 that the setting is changing. So when we pick up at the beginning of chapter 15, Jesus and his disciples have gotten up, and now they are on the move. We don't really get any other hints about their whereabouts until chapter 18, where we read in verse 1, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered." That is a bit perplexing because it says there in chapter 18 that they went out to this garden, yet it's 3 chapters earlier that he says, "Rise, let us go from here." So are we to believe that he said, "Rise, let us go from here," and then they all sat there for another half hour while he went through chapter 15 and chapter 16 and chapter 17, and then they finally got up at the end of 17, the beginning of 18? Well, no, there's a simpler explanation than this. If you go and look at Matthew chapter 26, verses 29 and 30 say, "I tell you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine again until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Well, that's basically the same pattern that we've seen in John. They're sitting together at table, they're eating their meal, and then they get up and they go out to the Mount of Olives. And aside from the additional detail that they sang a hymn at some point in here, it looks like pretty much the same thing. But here's the kicker. In Matthew 26, this whole long conversation that we've been reading in John takes place between the word kingdom at the end of verse 29 and them leaving the upper room in verse 30 to go out to the Mount of Olives. There's a whole lot going on here. We get the same impression if we look at Mark's gospel. There's also the same slight confusion over the timing of Peter's insistence that he won't deny Jesus, although there's no reason that couldn't have happened twice. And Luke chapter 22 gives us a little bit more help. Verses 7 through 13 help to establish the setting. Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it. So they said to him, Where will you have us prepare it? He said to them, Behold, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters, and tell the master of the house, The teacher says to you, Where is the guest room, that I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished. Prepare it there. And they went and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. So they've been sitting in this upper room that Jesus had apparently previously arranged here. That's also in Matthew and Mark, although we get the most detail here in Luke. And then Luke also gives us this impression that Peter's argument with Jesus about whether he would deny him takes place in that room. But Matthew and Mark made it sound like that discussion took place while they were on the way out to the Mount of Olives. And that adds into our confusion about when John chapter 15 is taking place. There's a really easy answer for all of this. Jesus had the discussion with Peter both while they were in that upper room, and then it came up again while they were on the road. We tend to think of this as leaving the upper room, getting to the Mount of Olives, but in reality, there's a period in between there where they are walking. And that's when chapter 15 of John's Gospel takes place. There's a lot of sort of agricultural metaphor here, and while that's pretty normal, it's especially common when they're in agricultural sorts of settings. And so it might be tempting to assume that they're already at the Mount of Olives, they're already at that garden, but it doesn't appear to be the case. It's pretty clearly the destination, but not the scenery that they get along the way. Jesus and the disciples are walking through Jerusalem. They're making their way to the gate that led out of the city on the east, where they would cross the brook Kidron and finally ascend to the Mount of Olives. Let's pick up in verse 1 of John 15 and read down through verse 11. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments, and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. Right from the beginning, you'll notice that we're getting another of these important I ams from Jesus. I am the vine. That's an interesting metaphor. I am the vine and you are the branches. He's trying to show how they get their life, in a manner of speaking, from him. Now that's in a spiritual sense, although there's an argument to be made that as the creator of all things, they get their life from him in a physical way as well. But he has the spiritual in mind here, and especially their ability to bear fruit is tied to the question whether they are connected to him. If you take a branch from a vine and you cut it off and then you leave it, it's not going to bear any fruit. Yeah, it'll stay alive for a very short period, but without that source, without that connection to the source vine, it just can't live on its own. And that's what Jesus wants to get across to them. They are not independent of him. They will not bear fruit unless they remain connected to him. He says in verse 3 that they are clean, and that is much like what he mentioned at the beginning of chapter 13 when he talked about washing their feet and making them clean. And then he talks about abiding in each other. They should abide in Jesus, and Jesus will abide in them. What does that mean? Okay, maybe that's not the way that we talk, but I still think it's fairly obvious what he's trying to get at, right? He's talking about unity. The word abide, even if we don't use that, a synonym for it would be remain. So remain in me and I will remain in you. That still is not the sort of thing that we would say, but at least it's comprehensible. When we overlay that on the discussion of the vine and the branches, it's fairly obvious what's going on, right? He's saying, stay connected to me, and I will stay connected to you. Partake of me, and I will partake of you. Be unified with me, and I will be unified with you. We ought to be one. As the branch gets its food from the vine and dies if it is cut off, and the vine has very little purpose if not to feed those branches and allow them to bear fruit. The connection between Jesus and his disciples is very important, and it must be something real and not just imagined or faked. Unfortunately, we see an awful lot of this faked relationship in the world today. He follows this up in verse 7 with another promise that he will answer prayers, and he's not granting them unlimited power. He is not saying that he will be at their beck and call to do whatever they demand, nothing of the sort. But think about it in these terms. If we are abiding in Jesus, then what sort of things will we be asking? We'll be requesting the things that he wants to give, the things that he intended to give. We'll be asking things according to his will. That's the way that John himself will put this very notion in 1 John chapter 5 later on. 1 John 5:14, and this is the confidence that we have toward him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. Clearly, all these discussions with Jesus had a very lasting impact on John. 60 years later, he's still repeating them and trying to teach those things to other Christians. In verse 8, he says that bearing fruit is what proves that you are one of his disciples, and that bearing fruit also glorifies God and reflects unity with God, much as there's unity with Jesus. He gives more instructions to keep his commandments, which is a little redundant, perhaps, to give the commandment to keep his commandments, but nevertheless. And more specifically, the main commandment that he's really concerned about here is love each other. And then he gives some commentary on that, abide in love. This is sort of John's introduction to love as the great focus of Jesus and his gospel. It's not that we haven't seen love show up before in John's gospel, but it's going to be a little bit more of a focus in the next few verses and in the succeeding chapters, and then especially when you get into John's letters later on. 1 John chapter 4, just read verses 7 through 12 of that chapter once this program is over, and I think you'll get what I'm saying. In any case, he's going to give us a pretty clear definition of that love pretty soon. But before we get there, he introduces this idea of filling up joy, which is not a phrase that you have ever used before in your life, I guarantee. Now, this is something that appeared back in chapter 3 when John the Baptist used this expression. It's going to show up again in chapter 16 and then again in 17. And John very clearly latched onto it, and he uses it in 1 John and in 2 John. What does it mean? Okay, let's parse this whole phrase. That your joy may be full. The idea is that there already is some pre-existing joy for whatever reason, let's say abiding in him. Now Jesus is saying that he has been going beyond and he has been trying to tell them these new things so that there would be more joy. As if there's more available, and so you've got perhaps a vessel that can hold your joy, and you've already got some there, but fill that cup up with joy. That's the goal, to fulfill the measure of joy that is available. Verse 12, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you, so that you will love one another. John's doing that thing again where he repeats himself over and over in slightly different ways, and apparently it's a habit he picked up from Jesus. In these few verses, Jesus has summarized all of the commandments that he's ever given them into one: love one another. This is not the first time he said this, and it won't be the last time that he says this. How are they to love one another? As he loved them. Well, that's pretty extreme, as he's about to mention. The greatest love is to lay down one's life for one's friends, and that's what Jesus has already been doing. He's been sacrificing himself for them on a daily basis. He's shown concern for their well-being. He has taken care of them day in and day out, and he's been looking forward to eternity and promising to take care of them forever. And now he's saying that he wants them to imitate that love for each other. And not only is this a lesson intended for Peter and Andrew and James and John and so on, this is a lesson intended for us, for all of Jesus' followers, that we are supposed to treat each other the way that Jesus treats us. And beyond those day-to-day sacrifices, beyond giving of himself constantly, he was actively pursuing his own death at this time for the eternal well-being of his friends. That is some next level love, and that's what he expects of his disciples too. And yet he says, "You are my friends if," what? Verse 14, "if you do what I command you." It might seem a little strange for Jesus to make that conditional and say, well, maybe you're not really my friends. But honestly, that's pretty fair, isn't it? I mean, one of this inner circle is his betrayer, and it's pretty difficult to make the case that Judas is really his friend because Judas isn't keeping his commandments. I hate to harp on this point of Jesus' conditional love because it always frustrated me when I was younger and someone was teaching the Bible and spent all of their time explaining what it wasn't saying. Verse 16 is really easy to stuff into the list of Calvinistic, "nothing is up to me" philosophy proof texts. "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you." Honestly, by the time we get to the second half of that verse, a lot of people have completely tuned out because they're so focused on "you did not choose me, but I chose you." And to be clear, we shouldn't try to castrate that verse and remove all of its vitality. But he clearly presents all of this with the assumption that they have the capacity to obey him, that they have the capacity to choose to love him and to love each other and to choose to be his friends, to choose to keep his commandments, which is why he says, "You are my friends if you keep my commandments." That designation is conditional. He doesn't say, "You are my friends and therefore you will keep my commandments whether you like it or not." He says, "You are my friends if you do what I command you." Now, a devoted Calvinist would accuse me at this point of taking sovereignty away from God and claiming to have the ability to save myself. But of course, that's not what I said. Jesus, more importantly, hasn't said either of these two things. Jesus has expectations. And while he does help, and he does empower his followers to do his will, he doesn't compel you to do anything. If you insist on rejecting him, he will grudgingly comply with that. On the topic of choosing an election and that sort of thing, let me just point out that Jesus also chose Judas. And Judas chose to rebel. That same choice is available to the world that he's about to mention, who will choose to hate his disciples as they chose to hate him. Verse 18, "If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. But all these things they will do to you on account of my name, because they do not know him who sent me." If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have been guilty of sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works that no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have seen and hated both me and my Father. But the word that is written in their law must be fulfilled. They hated me without a cause. Jesus says a lot of things in this book that are mind-bending, and that's pretty deliberate. He's trying to teach his disciples to think in a different way, a way that's centered on God, not themselves, a way that considers his will and his commandments to be not just binding, not just mandatory, but our will. The whole point here is to reorient our priorities and our decision-making process and put it where it belongs, in God's hands. Don't use that as an excuse to claim that whatever you're doing has his stamp of approval. That approach doesn't fly, and he's not happy with people who claim God's authority when they don't have it. Also, don't use keeping his commandments as a way to claim that you have saved yourself. That also doesn't fly. Let's go back to the world hating those who follow Jesus. One of the things that I often find myself telling my oldest boy is as follows: nothing worth doing is easy. Usually I find myself telling him this when he wants to do something or is looking for some result, but either doesn't know how or knows how but tries and fails a few times and gets discouraged and frustrated. Nothing worth doing is easy. That's not a universal truth. It's worth eating breakfast, for example, and that's pretty easy. But think behind that. Once upon a time, you had to learn how to eat. You had to learn how to use utensils. As a baby, you had to learn how to control your muscles and how to suck and swallow milk, and you had to figure out the relationship between those actions and the pain in your stomach without any context or objective communication. Instinct played a role, of course, but I have observed this process closely a number of times now, and it is tough. But it's worth it. It makes life a whole lot easier in the future. From an axiomatic perspective, nothing worth doing is easy. If it were easy, then it wouldn't bring much reward. That is the same point that Jesus is trying to get across to his disciples here. He's dispensed a lot of comfort in these last few chapters with the foot washing and telling them to lean on each other and abide in him. He tells them that even the one who denies him clearly, Peter, is going to return and follow him afterward. He tells them that he's going to go and prepare a place for them. He says he's coming back. He says that he is a window to the Father and that if they have seen him, they have seen God. He promised them the Holy Spirit. He says he's going to answer their prayers. But don't get the idea that it's all a walk in the park. No, for followers of Jesus, there will be resistance, and there will often be hostile resistance. That doesn't mean that you should assume any resistance you encounter is a confirmation you're on the right track. That's not the way it works. Measure yourself against the standard that Jesus presents, but expect the way to be difficult, because nothing worth doing is easy. How much more difficult do you think it will be when it is the most worthwhile pursuit possible? The pursuit of eternal life in God's presence. That's a sobering thought. It's going to be rough. Now Jesus softens it a bit by going back to the comforts in verses 26 and 27. But when the Helper comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who proceeds from the Father, he will bear witness about me. And you also will bear witness, because you have been with me from the beginning. Now that's the same thing that he's been promising for quite a long time now. There's not much new here, but it's a reminder that if they didn't hear it a few sentences ago, the goal is for these guys to go and make more disciples like themselves. You also will bear witness because you have been with me from the beginning. Jesus' speech isn't over yet. It's going to go most of the way through chapter 16 without a break, and then even after that, he'll pick back up and continue on into chapter 17. Although he's addressing his Father at that point, he clearly intends for his disciples to hear it. But here, at the end of chapter 15, we at least find a transition into the next phase of the discussion, which will focus even more on the promise of the Holy Spirit, which he's just reintroduced in verse 26. That's where we will pick up in a few weeks, but I'd like to wrap up this installment by going back to the last few verses of the previous section. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have been guilty of sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works that no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have seen and hated both me and my Father. There was a period of your life during which you were not accountable for your actions and decisions. You didn't fully comprehend your own free will. You didn't fully comprehend the relationship between your decisions and the future, both for yourself and for others. At some point, you learned. At some point, you became accountable. Jesus is talking about the accountability of his own people, the Jews who by and large had rejected him, and especially the religious authorities of the Jews. They were accountable because they saw and heard. Now, you too are accountable for what Jesus has said. You too know what he said and did. What are you doing with it? Are you his friend? Do you keep his commandments? Are you one of his chosen? Do you abide in him? Are you bearing fruit? If the answer to any of those questions is no, and you would like some help, then we would be glad to offer you some assistance at River Ridge. You can get in touch with us over the phone, 812-550-6234, or over email, info@riverridgechurch.org. You can get in touch with us on Facebook or even on YouTube if that's the easiest way for you to reach out. We would love to help you to become a follower of Jesus and become a friend of Jesus, and help you along the way into bearing fruit for him and going and teaching his gospel to others as well. If you are already one of his disciples, but are looking for other fruitful branches to work with, then feel free to get in touch with us. Those same avenues will work, and we would love to have you pulling in the same direction as we are. You can come and join us for worship at 10 a.m. Sundays at 5600 Van Road, and also at 4 p.m. Sundays and 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for our Bible study. We would love to get to know you. We would love to be of assistance. We would love to worship with you and get closer to God and abide in him together. Next week, we will be zooming way out and looking at the whole New Testament. But for today, I will say thank you for spending this time with me on Iron Sharpens Iron. If we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. I don't think that's in chapter 5. That's in chapter 3, 4, chapter something. Oh, man, I was right the first time. 1 John 5:14, and this is the confidence that we have.